Hey, Caitlin, and welcome to the Future of UX.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy that you're here. Super excited to dive into the topic of AI customer research, Claude, how to use AI. So before we are diving into everything, I would say do a quick intro and tell the listeners who you are and what you're doing.
Sure. So I have a mixed background. I usually start with that because I think it's important. I'm an ex-UX designer, but before that I was also in marketing and digital strategy, and then sort of ended up being more focused on research. But I've done research across all those roles and think it's probably a good thing that I can take all of those perspectives while doing research. For the last couple of years, I've been pretty much entirely focused on AI customer research, or using AI in the best possible ways and getting better results when doing insights work.
Cool. I really love this diverse background, and I feel this is always such a plus if you're working in design with customers, with people, to have that empathy and to really zoom out and also working with AI, or have this broad understanding. This is so cool. How did you start to use AI in the first place? I'm curious.
I got really curious all the way back in 2022, the end of the year, when ChatGPT first went kind of mainstream live for all of us to use. And I think, like most people, I had sort of a certain reasonable amount of apprehensiveness. But, I very quickly kind of realized that this was one of those moments in time that is, or I would get left behind if I didn't start to grab the bull by the horns and try to understand it as well as I could from the start. So I did that pretty quickly. I was still critical and careful about things and didn't immediately trust everything I was seeing and getting out of the results. But I knew that I needed to try to figure it out, understand how large language models work, where their kind of benefits and limitations are, what works consistently, what doesn't, and why, in order to kind of be able to continue doing my craft and working the way that I like to work in the future. And it was out of my own curiosity and feeling that I had to keep up. But the fact that I ended up now doing what I'm doing, focused entirely on it, was not really by choice, because as we were talking about before we started recording, I also had a baby. It's my
Mhm.
first child. And I went on maternity leave for a shorter amount of time than a lot of people in Europe, but I came back and didn't have any client requests. So my previous way of working, kind of retainer based with individual product or research teams, was no longer an option. And the thing I kept getting requests for was around the stuff I was posting on LinkedIn, which was all around how I was experimenting with AI for different research use cases.
Hmm. I think that makes so much sense. Right? Line and adjust a little bit based on also your circumstances, and then with AI, I mean, we also talked about it prior the recording, opens up a lot of new opportunities, especially for people who don't have the same amount of time and want to be a little bit more productive. What would you say are the areas, especially in AI customer research, where AI really makes sense, where AI really makes a huge difference compared to maybe doing things manually without AI?
I think the time aspect is kind of the easy one to point out. The one that's almost as much, maybe just as much of an impact for the ability to do a more complete job than I think I was able to do before I was using AI, because I've worked for a long time as kind of a solo operator. I was a head of user research in a SaaS company before I kind of went freelance. Even there, I was very often kind of like working on a project on my own because we had a limited
Mhm.
number of people working in the team doing insights. And, and then as a consultant, I would be brought in to lead a project, support a team with training, but also take on some new kind of figuring out who the actual ICP was and projects like that. Working on your own has so many limitations. You still have the same sort of tight deadlines, especially in startups and scale ups. And you have to do so much in so little time that most of the time isn't really possible. And so now with I think in a funny way, I'm cutting fewer corners because I'm
Mhm.
actually able to get AI to fill in all that I would have deprioritized, because I would have said, oh, I need to deliver this by tomorrow. I don't have time. And now I can say, AI can pick up the slack. I can actually be more complete in what I'm delivering because I don't have to base this only on what I can do.
Mhm. I think super cool examples, right? To see the opportunities that AI brings and makes your work even better. What would you say, or like how does it look in practice? So when you're working on a research project, you do some customer research, like from the start to finish. What would you say? Where do you sprinkle AI in and how? Just get a bit on, like a bit hands on. I'm curious.
I have kind of a general principle. I think every project is going to be a little bit different because, you know, helping a team understanding where onboarding is going wrong is very different
Mhm.
from exploratory research. Like I've done a bunch of research with different teams testing whether they should launch in a new market, which is a completely different animal, right? Than
Yeah.
design decisions on a smaller kind of in a part of the product. So I think where you use AI is very different on the amount of risk, the amount of uncertainty, the amount of existing knowledge that you have about the part of the product or the users that you're going after or but generally I say with most things that I do with AI for insights, I try to start from my own expertise or my own understanding or the team's understanding of the problem space or the customer. Get that down if it isn't already. Like document that, which I think ties into the rest of what we're going to talk about today, but document that in the first place so that you have your own expertise and the pieces from your own brain and your own knowledge in the first place before you even open up a chat in any way, shape, or form or start an agent. And that's really crucial for me. So regardless of how, where I put AI in which steps or,
Mhm,
whether
mhm.
I'm creating agentic feedback loops for itself or whether I'm manually checking, almost less important than make sure we start with our own knowledge and
Mhm.
understanding of like what we know about the customer, what we know about the product behavior, and then also what would make this project good, right? Because I think so many people still struggle with identifying what good research would look like in this case
Yeah,
before
I
they
agree.
just let AI start doing it for them. And that's the source of.
So what would you say? What would you write in this document? You already mentioned like your customers, your goals, maybe some problems that you are currently trying to solve, some questions. Do you write like everything that you have in that doc, or do you have, I don't know, like those top 10 topics that you always mention in this documentation?
I think the more important pieces are things like what decision are
Hmm.
we making, but also what decisions have already been made, things that we are not going to cover in this research scope, right? Like what's in versus what's out, very clearly defined.
Mm.
Definitions of segments or who we think our segments are. Like those are to me all of the fundamental pieces, but also a set of beliefs. I sometimes start with a set of beliefs and we can say either we can turn these beliefs into concrete facts because we can point at all of this evidence that already exists, right? So we know that that's true. A high level of accuracy or high level of confidence.
Mhm.
And then there's other pieces or lists, items in that list of beliefs that say are probably hypotheses, but at least having them in place before we say, hey, Claude, go, help us make this
Yeah.
decision. And it comes back and, tells us a whole new set of beliefs. And we're now confused about what the priority was and what we should be paying
Yeah.
attention to instead of follow whatever Claude says instead of what we started with.
Yeah, I think this is such a good tip, and what a lot of people skip, or what a lot of design teams skip. Yeah, right. Maybe a little bit of instruction, a little bit of background information, but I assume it's most of the times not enough. You probably need a little bit more, and especially I like what you mentioned there, focusing on the decisions that have been made, and also on the scope, like what's in our scope and what's out of scope. At least from my experience, you get a little bit lost into all the opportunities, and you get excited about the insights, and then you like move out of the scope and get lost at some point, right? So that can happen. Okay, so the first step was that this document it could be like a text document, right, or a Google Drive
Yeah.
document.
So when I start, that is usually like a notes document. Like I jot down all of these things or I make a team jot those things down into a document. What's really important though is if we want to work with Claude Code or any other kind of file-based system, all of those things won't necessarily live in the same place. So if we want to kind of start turning our knowledge and the things that we believe Claude or any other non-human entity is going to need from us to do the best possible job, then we actually need to think about where all of those things belong.
Mhm.
Are they all things that need to be given to Claude every time we like open a chat in a specific folder, regardless of whether we're doing a design workflow or a decision, support process or an insights workflow? Or are they things that should be fed at specific pieces times? So we have to think a little bit more, like that's the second step.
Mhm.
And honestly, I don't usually have to think about most of that from scratch, especially if I'm working with a team that has kind of already done that with me, and then we start a second project. We already have most of that in place. Or if I'm doing things for myself, like mining insights from my own work, my own kind of coursework and so on, I have those systems in place that kind of always apply.
Mhm.
So you may create that sort of thing that you have all of those, segment definitions, things we already know, decisions that have been made. Those are things that could apply to everything you do for the next 6 months or a year. And then there are the things like the research questions, the decision we're making right now that will be more project specific.
Mhm. Or the scope, for example, right? This could
Exactly.
also be okay. Cool. And how do you feed this into Claude now? So we
Yeah.
defined the areas that, like the background information and some of the questions that we maybe partially use for only parts of the project.
Let me share my screen.
Yeah, sure.
All right. I have a folder here. So do you see my folder that
Yeah.
says Whoop screen? Great. So this is a fake folder, to be clear. I don't work with Whoop. I never have. So this is entirely fake data and information here. But I use this as an example when I demo things because I think a lot of people know what Whoop is. And I have this fake project where I'm pretending that I'm exploring the idea of having a screen on the famously screenless armband. This is an example of what a project
Maybe
folder often
for
looks like.
everyone who doesn't know Whoop, could
Oh,
you
yeah.
explain real quick what it is?
Sure. So Whoop is like a fitness tracking armband. It measures heart rate and your sleep, tracks your sleep and tells you how well you're recovered, if you've done a workout the previous day, whether you should work out again, and so on. So it's a bit of a recovery and activity tracking. And it doesn't have a screen. It's intentionally screenless, so it's not supposed to distract you from, going about your day, doing your workouts. But I'm exploring in a lot of my synthetic data. I have sets around things like Whoop would add a screen and whether the kind of synthetic data that I've created is saying that they should or shouldn't. And I have a lot of Easter eggs hidden in there, buried to trick AI a little bit sometimes and see if it actually comes up with the same answers that I would.
Cool.
So just an insight into how I test things and how I test workflows and whatever I do with AI. And so this is one of the kind of fake project folders that I have, but this is exactly what my real project folders look like and the ones that I put together with clients and students in my courses. What I have here within one project, this could be, an onboarding redesign or whatever it is you're working on. There are folders here. This is for kind of insights work, but you can imagine that there might be like a design drafts folder. So the Claude Markdown file is one place where some of the information we just talked about goes. But then we also have things like rules file, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then we also have a context file. So the Claude Markdown file, here the Claude MD, for anyone who's new to this, is where the sort of essential information about this particular project. Anyone who would work on this, obviously it's AI, but anyone who would work on this project needs to understand. So we have the research questions, the decision work, things like segment definitions, who we're kind of looking at data from in this project. Uh, Anything else you think would really be essential to understand about this whole project before working on anything in here. But then we probably want to have more details, like we were just talking about, have maybe more kind of deep dives into who our segments are, how we define them, what they look like, background information and data we have about. Maybe we want to detail more about the research questions, where they came from, what we already know, and why why we have these questions and not other ones. I also have things like a code book to start with if we're coding survey responses and things like that. So there can be tons of context in here. And so you don't necessarily build all of this from scratch if you're just kind of starting your first project and starting, creating all of these files. But I think you can imagine that we might create at least these ones before we do any sort of analysis or insights work with a set of data, because having research questions and segment definitions will already give Claude so much better background information to anchor to before kind of making assumptions about who our segments are and what they look like.
How do you reference the different MD files to each other? So in the main Claude MD file, referencing the other MD files or the other folders, or do you leave this to Claude to find this on?
So the Claude MD is something that every time you do any workflow in this folder. So I have my Claude terminal chat window open over here just because I've opened it. I started up this chat within this project. So based the chat, if this is new to listeners, you can start up a chat by just kind of opening a window and writing Claude. And then this is going to access everything on my computer, which I don't always want it to do. I mean, it will always have access to everything on my computer, but if I want to do an insights workflow, I don't really want it like hunting through all of my files on my computer if it can't find the right one, right? Whereas if I launch in one project folder like this, keeps it a bit more contained. So once I've done that, if I were to do something like survey analysis, which is a skill I've set up, like a hard-coded workflow that will run on its own, this will automatically load this context file, but it won't automatically load all of these. And that's intentional because I want to give it the basic information that it would need for anything it does, which will be loaded every time. But if I want to give just this survey analysis workflow access to the code book, for example, I don't want the code book loaded every time I do like a design workflow in here. I only want it to load with this skill. So this skill has instructions that points to that. This doesn't need to. This one's just the high level overview. Hey, Claude, this is what this project is about. This is what we're digging into, what decision we're making, and so on. But every time a workflow needs more detail, more specific information to get that particular task done, then you can kind of use all of these files on demand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you basically mention them in the terminal, or you use a skill where the MD file is connected.
Yeah. So in the
Right?
skill, it points to this. The skill file has a set of instructions that say something before you start coding, look at codebook.md.
And where did you save your skills? They're not in this folder, right? So they are more, you save them somewhere else, right?
Yeah, they're saved on the user level. So they're under here on my top level user level. And that's where I tend to save everything, just so that I can always access all the skills. Yeah.
I think this is also super interesting because I assume, I mean, not sure if listeners or viewers have used skills at some point. If you are just starting out, you usually create your skills, you save it in your Claude app, right? Like you have your skills in your Claude app, but you can also download them and then save them on your computer on your user level, and then basically use these skills if you either use the terminal, if you use VS Code or Cursor or whatever, if you work locally on your computer, right? So you can use the same skills, but you can't access the skills that you have in your Claude app, right? You need to download them so you have them locally. I think this is important. And they're basically the same skills that you can create in the Claude app, right? So an MD file with references, with agents, whatever. Super cool. Thank you for seeing that. I think this is always super interesting also to see how content and insights and data can be structured. Not that you have everything in one file, but I've really liked how you have this brain file, pretty much, the Claude MD file that is loaded every time that you're working on the project, where you have all the general information. And then if you feel, I need to go deeper, you just tool you're using. And then it basically gives the information manually when you need this.
Kind of metaphor. If you've ever been managed or have managed, right? Like in either direction, you've had an experience of needing to tell, like, I need you to take over this project. and hopefully give them everything that they need to do a good job, or you've had a manager who gave you the things to do a good job. In either direction, you've had probably at least one experience in your life where that went not so well.
Mhm.
Like you didn't get the things you needed, you went back, your manager was like, "You did a bad job." And then you needed to go, "Okay, but I didn't have everything I needed," or something was missing. When we think of it that way, like that's what we're putting in these files. Like I always try to think of what did I actually really need to give someone who was working for me? Or did I get given a design brief that really wasn't as good? It should have been because I was missing something. I was missing some of the insights that kind of drove the decision to do this thing. So like those are the pieces that we have to build in somewhere. We want to be able to give Claude like a support the full package that it would need to do without coming back to us and going, "Oh, wait, you forgot this," or like, "Oh, what about this?" Or, "Do you have an answer to"
A hallucination, like
Yeah,
starting to come up with things that you never mentioned, you haven't mentioned, and then it comes up with its own ideas. We
exactly.
also don't want that, right?
Totally.
Makes total sense. Kind of insights would it need all went through the situation that you described, where we didn't have enough information and we didn't really know what to do. So I think that makes a lot of sense. To have that basically as a mental map when you create this Claude MD file. As the next step, which is probably step number 3, we are creating insights. We are using Claude to synthesize, doing some analysis for us, and we're getting insights. What is our next step with these insights that we are getting? Maybe we create this in the terminal, we have our insights there, or we save it locally somewhere. And what is the next step? Maybe also the handoff to the other department, right? You're not working in a bubble as a researcher.
I think the next step that most people do is seconding everything that came out of AI, to be honest. And I think this is really important because, one question I get asked often is how do we stop kind of triple checking everything? As a lot of teams who are very used to doing research and know how to do it well, whether they're designers or product managers or researchers, are still unable to immediately look and go, this is right or wrong. Because especially if you're doing, new work, you're not testing with old insights or old data files, you can't tell. Claude and all of the other large language models give you something that looks very confident and they can be filled with so many issues, but who can tell what's right and wrong? So I think everyone is still where let's say people fall into two camps, either overly trusting
Yeah.
or really second guessing everything and going, we spend, a fraction of time getting the insights out now from the data, but we kind of eat all of that time that we saved back up because we kind of triple check and compare exact details and data and the outputs. So I think a next step is actually implementing a workflow where you have a little bit of an iteration process. And that doesn't have to be that the human dig through every detail of what came out of Claude or other large language model. You need kind of a system. So either you need to say, okay, at an entry level, we are going to kind of do a spot check, like of a sample. So we take a sample of the outputs we got and we look at them closely and we compare with the exact data points and we make sure we can find all of the quotes, that the counts of responses to that multiple choice question make sense, add up, and everything. Or what I actually do, the advanced version that I think most people will not get to immediately after listening to this podcast, but just to plant a seed, is run structured evals. So if I run structured evals on a workflow I've designed, so I do like a survey analysis as a workflow, I design how Claude should do that. I run evals on that workflow so that the system I've designed is iterated until it gives you consistent outputs every time. They will not be perfectly exactly the same every time, but I want to see the same sort of insights so that we're not second guessing, like, well, it gave us these insights this time and a completely different set of insights the second time we ran the same process. Like, that's not what we want. So actually, before running any insights work, I do evals on my workflows to make sure they're reliable. And I really recommend that all teams start learning how to do that instead of going, like this prompt or this set of instructions work today and then not sure if it's going to work tomorrow. If you test like that more systematically, and when you're running the insights process for real and you get those outputs, you will automatically know whether you can be confident in those results, and you'll know like which details to more kind of spot check or more closely look at.
And how do you set these evals up? Just, like super simple, not in detail, just like that we get a sense of how we could get started.
Evals are just a set of measurements. Like
Mm-hmm.
a rubric. It's the equivalent of saying, um, for like after you output all or like from a set of results, from a set of survey response, analysis results, go back in the same, run the same process again, and then check if all of the numbers, all of the counts for all of the multiple choice questions, like the measure is the counts from the multiple choice questions and whether
Mm-hmm.
they are all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the rubric says if they're all the same, you get a pass. And if there's one of the three that is different than the other two, then it's a fail.
Okay.
That's a very simple one. But you can design evals for pretty much anything. You just need to have tangible measures for things. Whether you're doing survey analysis, interview analysis, any sort of like design workflow where you want to make sure that you get the same kind of view with the exact style guide you gave it every single time, you can create an
Oh,
eval
yeah.
for that.
Okay. Oh, yeah, cool. So it's basically thinking about parameters, certain measurements, how you could measure something, find this, write this down, and then see if it matches the result, right?
Exactly.
I mean, like just like super simple. Of course, it's more complex. It gets more complex. And is this something that you as a researcher would set up or someone else in the team?
I set it up. And it's really just, it's a document. Like everything else that we've talked about here, it's another document. It's just a
Crazy,
file.
right? Yeah.
It's a file that basically says, like, this is what we're measuring. We're measuring the accuracy of the counts of
Mm-hmm.
these multiple choice questions. And we are determining whether you come up with the same answer or the same count for all of them across 3 runs. And you just clarify exactly how to measure everything and exactly what counts as a pass or a fail, whether it's a percentage or all 3 have to be exactly the same in order to pass and so on.
And would this be an MD file as well that you share with Claude?
Yeah. So I have a few evaluations set up that are a skill.
Mm-hmm.
So just like I would run a skill that's called survey analysis, or you could do skill wireframe, app wireframes or something like that, and it runs a series of tasks. It's a file, but it's a skill file, so that I can do like /eval1, and it just takes a certain data set or like whatever data set I've told it to use and runs one process 3 times or 5 times or 7 times, whatever I've specified in the instructions. But it's really just that one skill file that says, hey, here's the rubric, here's the eval system you need to apply, and here's how to run the experiment, basically. Like, run it 3 times, use the same data set, ask me which data.
Okay. Cool. Okay. That makes sense. But do you always use the terminal for that? Or also always the terminal? Mhm.
I know
Cool.
it's like for
Because
so
things
many
are
people, it's
locally.
like, oh, cringe, who wants to sit in the terminal? But I mean, former designer, I also appreciate an actually designed UI. I
Yeah.
am getting really used to it because I find that there are just some things that come really natural when you're sitting in the terminal. Like you said, everything is
Mm-hmm.
just lives locally. You know where your file paths are. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
do pretty much everything the same way. You can do all of the same things in the Claude desktop app in the code tab, but I have gotten really used to the terminal, to be honest.
Yeah. Fascinating. I mean, sometimes I'm working with the terminal, but to be honest, yeah, it's a bit, it's not so visually. And I also know a lot of
I
designers
know.
who get really scared of the terminal. So it's great to hear about your experience and your workflow, because I hope that, it removes the scarcity a little bit for designers to just like experiment and try this out. Because like with all the commands, it can be overwhelming.
Like,
But cool.
non-technical person here. I'm really not a technical person in a way, so I can tell you, you can get used to it. I have gotten so used to it that at this point it's like hard for me to use something else like Cowork or something that is designed to remove you from the terminal. I'm not sure if I'll be able to make that switch.
And I think this is also pretty interesting. You just mentioned Cowork. Cowork is basically the using the terminal, but in a nice way. So I think a lot of people think, oh, this is magic, what all the agents are doing there. Yeah, it's pretty much using the terminal in a nicer interface. Right.
It is, like, to clarify for people, is more sandboxed. Like, there are more reasons why I'm not switching from the terminal to Coworks. There aren't so many arguments for me not to use the Claude desktop app, because that is functionally the equivalent. But Cowork is sandboxed. You don't have the same exact direct access to, like, files and functionality and, like, yeah, I mean, there's just a little bit more complexity that you can do in terminal.
Do you think it's for safety reasons, or why are there not the same functionalities in Cowork?
That I don't know. I can imagine that it could be for safety reasons, but I'm not sure. Like, I have a hard time imagining where they're going with that. Maybe it is to try to get more non-engineering teams to adopt it and be able to control a bit more permission-wise what's accessible and not. I can imagine that, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so next step. Now we validated our insights. We made sure that everything's aligned with the content that we shared. So we are ready to basically share our insights. How does the handoff looks like?
I think I even have a visual I could show you for this.
Yeah, sure. Great.
Give me a second. So if we've got insights, imagine you have an insights team or you're a design team kind of doing the insights work, that often starts the process, right? Like, we're starting with insights when we're doing things as well as we can be, then we're starting with that. And that usually informs maybe like simultaneously either product decisions and design work starting, or we're starting with writing a PRD and getting kind of the decisions around product changes done first before handing off to design. And so all of this can be done in synced files, ideally, like when a team is able to work either with, Dropbox, where you're actually syncing very consistently from the cloud to your own desktop, then it's not usually a problem. And otherwise, another term or another platform that's going to make designers cringe a little bit, but we can use GitHub and do Git pull requests if you're working in the terminal. It does start feeling like we're getting more technical here. I realize that, but I just want to flag that that's a really good system for making sure that all of the teams actually get the same documents more or less in real time, right? You can trigger a pull request to actually just get all of the information you need before you start working on design. And even if it was just updated like an hour ago, then, you get everything you're supposed to have.
Could you explain real quick what a pull request is? I assume that most designers don't work with GitHub, but I think it's important to know.
So GitHub is basically an engineering platform for having all of these development files stored in one place that can be accessible from the terminal. So as you're working, like traditionally, as you're working and you're coding things, you could do a pull request that kind of gets the latest versions of files that you need to kind of keep working. And you do that all from within the terminal. Now, what we can actually do as like insights teams or design teams is have a repository, basically like a collection of files that is, for example, within a project, like my Whoop screen project, latest insights could be a folder, and the insights team could be pushing the latest analysis and findings and results into that folder, and the design team or the product team could pull that straight into their terminal where they're working. It's like, another more advanced version of like if you're using Dropbox and you're sharing folders and everything, that usually works too. But pull requests tend to be a little bit more of a stable way of doing it and controlling and making sure that you have the latest version of everything. Whereas, if you're using Dropbox, that tends to be stable too, but depending on how you have your sync settings set up, you might be a little bit delayed. So that's just more kind of, you have more control there. But the point is, we want to have a system where everything is file-based, but whatever is delivered by insights, as soon as they save that, we can kind of keep moving because we can immediately just pull those results into continued product and design work without someone having to like send it to us in an email or a Slack message, right? So that gets pulled straight in, synced in read only ideally, right? So no one should be kind of modifying those files, but we just get kind of like extract what we need from the originals. And then as design or products start working, those teams have their own versions of like the Claude MD file and other context and rules files in their folders. So they can kind of take the insights, but run their own workflows and in a more controlled environment where they've already like hard coded their standards into documentation that Claude picks up when it needs it and so on.
And just a quick question in between, like you had like your Whoop app locally on your computer, right? Some things you probably also share with your team. How do you make sure that the things that you have locally on your computer are still up to date with the things that is on GitHub? And maybe, my colleague has updated versions on these MD files on their computer and then they're working on different. How do you make sure that everything's aligned?
Yeah, so ideally this would be something that I can actually pull from GitHub. So the whole folder might be like a shared team folder, or even just something like, you can choose whether it's the whole folder or it's data or it's the context files. But that you should, I would be able to pull the latest versions directly from like a GitHub repository that the whole team is using. So in theory, like I'm working solo here, but if this is a team folder, then everyone needs to be able to access it from the same place. And so it would be kind of like the master version is the one that's updated in GitHub or in your Dropbox, right? And you just need to make sure that either you have pulled it from GitHub, you've done a pull request, or you are syncing this, in real time from Dropbox. So you always have the latest version.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Thanks for the tip. I assume that a lot of teams are struggling with the consistency and manually changing things. So I think makes total sense to pull this from GitHub, have there this shared space, and then pull all the content from GitHub and use it from there.
Yeah. One thing I highlighted here because I think it's really important to talk about like an additional benefit that I see of using Claude Code or sort of like a file-based system, the ability to automatically keep a record of decisions along the way, because this has been a big topic for me the whole time that I have, worked in research and product teams, especially, that the decisions made are not always based on insights. I think that's a frustration a lot of insights people have. But also, even when they aren't made on insights for good reason, because there are other kind of facts or forces that just override that for the moment, that's not documented very well, or it's not shared with everyone very well. And so when we're working with this kind of file system where Claude can also be set up to automatically take in like the information from different parts of this workflow, also pull in from connected transcription services, like if you're using Granola or Fireflies or whatever to record your stakeholder meetings, pulling that into and keeping a log of the discussions and the decisions that are made throughout this process. That can be so valuable, both for just making sure everyone's on the same page and understands what decisions were made and where did they come from, and also keeping us accountable so that when we kind of redo some part of the product and we launch it, and we either did or didn't base those changes on insights that were documented, that's here. And so we launch something, we see the results, Claude can automatically kind of pluck the information from the launch results, if that's in a database somewhere, take the decisions that were made, access the original insights and so on, and actually do a comparison on its own to help us understand how well are we making decisions, what result did our decision have on the results that we had, and so on. So the documentation takes on a kind of life of its own here, right? Because we have the documentation, like this file system throughout, that we're using as the backbone of any workflow we do. But we can also set up Claude to kind of document really interesting things along the way without us doing it at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how you set up this whole folder structure, how well this is all documented. I think for me, like, super cool to see. So first of all, thanks for sharing. I think this is super, super interesting. Do you usually prepare these files for clients as a researcher? Is this something like, who does that? For inside a team? I'm curious.
Let me just come back to you here. Yeah, sometimes I do, but really it's done with Claude. I mean, so whether I do it or somebody else does it, it's really, again, like back to my first principle of working with AI, it's somebody does a brain dump, right? Me, the team that I'm working with, somebody has to get their knowledge down on paper in one way or another, and then you feed that to Claude, and Claude creates everything for you. So if you want to create some sort of decision-making workflow or document decisions in a certain way, the best way is always to say, what are the pieces that would be important for me? Like, what's the outcome that we want to be able to get from this? Or what is the value that I would want from this? Is it about accountability? Or is it about improving our decision-making capabilities over time and how well we make decisions as a team? Telling that sort of thing to Claude, and then letting it put together all of the details and pieces into, in that case, it would probably be a hook or something that runs automatically to be capturing specific pieces of information from certain workflows that are run at certain times and then documented in the right way. Most things are that sort of template, like your brain, write down some notes, give it to Claude, and then iterate from there.
And where would you say things break in this process? Are there some limitations as well that we should be aware of?
Yeah, for sure. I think, the biggest places that things break are still where we put together workflows or documents that are really just not solid enough, right? Like, there's all of this is not a 100% certain solution to avoiding hallucinations, right? That's hallucinations or things being pieced together from different places in the wrong way by AI is still a fact of life using AI. So that's still absolutely potentially a breakpoint. I think there are other, more technical problems, like we were talking about, certain people not using the same tools or functionality as others, and therefore having outdated files, outdated folders. That's a big barrier to making sure that every process that I've kind of talked about on a high level can work properly. Because if someone has updated all of those context files or really important like Claude MD or rules files for doing certain types of work, and someone's using like the version 2 versions ago, they're going to be thinking that they're running a workflow and a process with the same standards baked in as you are, but they're not, right? And I think those are kind of the biggest points where we can design really good workflows, we can design really good file structures, but we do need to kind of still keep our eye on it and know that like the technology or our use of it can still break down a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, makes so much sense, right? Thanks for sharing also like the tips about the limitations. I think this definitely is a problem. Also, like what you mentioned earlier with also fact checking. If the content is right, setting up your own MD files to measure the results and see if everything's accurate. I think this makes a lot of sense. So such a fascinating process how you set everything up with the different files. And for all the listeners and viewers, if you would like to dive deeper into everything that Caitlin just shared, if you're really into AI customer research, Caitlin is also running a course, especially on that. where you will go much deeper and really dive into all of that in a live cohort, right? Like, when is the next one actually?
June. So beginning of June, it's 2 weeks. We do 2 hands-on live sessions, which are like working sessions. So everyone leaves those having actually built skills and like complex workflows and skills. And yeah, we talk about all of these things because there are a lot of complex things here to unpack. So I do my best to answer the kind of beginner blocker questions that come up as someone's like, I just opened the terminal for the first time in my life, and what am I doing here?
Yeah, a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Cool, that's wonderful. So I will definitely link it in the show notes. There's still some spots left, right? Or
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, perfect. So if you're interested, you can find the link in the show notes. Definitely check it out. I think super interesting to dive deeper into that. So really, really cool, especially if it's live. I think this is an extra bonus as right now. If you don't need to watch any YouTube tutorials, but if you can actually ask questions, I think this is so valuable right now.
I think so too.
Really be part of this community. So really, really cool that you're doing that. I love that. So what would you say are your last tips for people who would like to get started with Claude, with AI in research and customer research? What are maybe like your 3 tips for people to get started?
Ooh, honestly, the first one is what I've said a few times, but I'll say it in clearer terms. Spend some time outside of a large language model by yourself. I know, reflecting on how you do things and how you do them well. I think this is the biggest lever for people that no one is spending enough time on. So if you can, before you go, I'm going to have Claude do this workflow for me, think really critically about how you do it yourself if you do it manually, and what makes the outputs from your own work good, reliable, trustworthy, and so on. Try to get really explicit about that, very, very clear on that. It will make everything else easier because then you can hand those criteria and those checkpoints and so on off. The second is start thinking of agents really as just a series of files. I think I spent last year dabbling with agents here and there, and despite being an AI customer research person, feeling like behind on a lot of agentic things. But now I realize agents that work really well are essentially a sequence of very good files. So if you were to break down your own workflow into a series of files, what might that look like?
I love that. I love that because last year I also had this agent rabbit hole where I don't know, I created my own agent. It was all so complex. I spent so much time on it. And what you just said, I think this is pure gold. This is exactly it, right? It's all about the documentation, having really good documents of how like basically the system prompt, right? Like for an agent, a bit longer and more structured. This is what we need. Agents are not that complex. You can create your own agents. Today, it's very easy. You just need to document it well. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
And if I have to come up with a third, I feel like the third one is the hardest. I think we still should not hand off our judgment. So to be honest, I have decision-making workflows that I have built in Claude Code as skills where I get Claude to walk through decision-making processes with me. But I'm very careful not to let Claude guide me in a decision as far as I can control that or make the decision for me. I even tell it not to make a recommendation at the end of those. So I think we need to continue thinking of large language models as the execution layer for us. But, going back to the first tip, like use your own brain at the very beginning, download your own way of thinking about things and the criteria that you would have and the way that you would judge things in the first place. And then at the very end, like make sure you're still making decisions on your own.
Cool. Thank you. I think super important to not give the AI too much power, but that we still have our own judgment and taste and making our own decisions. I think sometimes it's exhausting to make decisions. So we use AI, but in the long term, this is not the right way. We need to do it if we want it or not. So
we need to keep the exhausting part a little bit. Like we need to prevent our brains from decaying by doing some of the more difficult thinking work. I think of it that way. If I feel like I haven't thought hard during the week, then I realize I have to like cut out an AI workflow.
that makes sense. Like, be critical about yourself and your own workflows. I think this is also a good reminder to and end this wonderful conversation with you, Caitlin. Thank you so much for being in the future of UX. I loved this episode. So hands-on. I also learned a ton, which I always love.
Cool.
And for everyone who would like to join the cohort, I will link it in the show notes so you can check it out and learn more. And if people would like to ask questions, reach out to you. I think the best is probably LinkedIn, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Yeah. Cool. Then, Caitlin, thank you so much for coming to the Future of UX and being my guest. I really loved it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.